Okay. Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Daniela Klaus. I'm the General Secretary of Press Club Concordia, which is the oldest press club in the world, and we are situated in Vienna. So a warm welcome from Vienna, from the center of Europe to everywhere in the world. I think we have a global audience, and we also have speakers from different parts of the world. So welcome to our speakers. Could you please mute yourself, whoever is speaking here? I have somebody speaking. Thank you. So welcome to our speakers, welcome to our audience. This is a seminar in a series of seminars that are held in cooperation between Press Club Concordia and the Forum for Journalism and Media in Vienna, and is supported by the Erste Foundation, which is a very important foundation for civil society in Europe. Also, we address European topics. Understanding the new international order is of utmost importance to Europe. And that's why we invited you, our experts from China, Russia, India, and Mexico / Latin America, to share different visions. The author of this series of seminars and also the moderator is Mirjana Tomic. If you don't know her already, you should know her because she's one of the best connected people I know. So that's it from my side. I'm really, really looking forward to this seminar, and I hand over to you, Mirjana.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and good morning to some of you, good afternoon to the other part of you. My name is Mirjana Tomic. I'm a former journalist, and I'm currently author and moderator of seminars on politics and media in Europe, specially designed for journalists and academic researchers. Most of our events focus on understanding the local context, and the speakers originate and in most cases live in the countries they talk about. Although we focus on Europe, as Daniela said, Europe is not alone in the world, and major wars are raging in our neighborhood. Just to give an example, the flight time from Vienna to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is less than 2 hours. And the border of Ukraine is closer to Vienna than the western border of Austria. So what is happening around here is felt where we are in Vienna in Central Europe. In the midst of wars, a new world order is emerging, which aspires to offer an alternative to the Western-dominated rule-based order. However, I think some rules have to exist, and I have invited experts from China, Russia, India, and Mexico to explain the contours of this new order, or at least how the leaders of those countries perceive it. I thank you so much for accepting the invitation, and I shall introduce the speakers. Yun Sun is a senior fellow and a co-director of the East Asia program and director of China program at the Stimson Center in Washington. Her expertise is Chinese foreign policy, US-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. Yun has studied in the United States and Beijing. Sergey Utkin, our speaker on Russia, is an associate professor of international politics at the University of Southern Denmark. He started his work there in 2022. Previously, he had his strategic assessment section at the Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Sergey studies in Moscow. Sushant Singh is lecturer in Southern Asian Studies at Yale University and consulting editor with the Caravan magazine in India, a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, and his writings have regularly appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the Walrus, Tagesspiegel, The Hindu, and other publications. Prior to that, he spent 20 years in the army. And last but not least, Isidro Morales is the founder and editor-in-chief of the quarterly journal Latin American Policy, an external fellow at the United States-Mexico Center of the Baker Institute at Rice University, and professor of international relations at the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla in Mexico. He lives in Mexico And he has studied. He has also taught at Colegio de México in Mexico City, in Copenhagen, in South Korea, and Tecnológico de Monterrey. Isidro studied in Mexico and in Paris. The format today is the following. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to explain this new world order, the way it is seen from Beijing, from New Delhi, from Moscow, and Mexico and Brazil, basically big Latin American countries. And then I will ask a few questions, and of course, you will have plenty of Q&A time to ask each one of them whatever is of interest to you. The new international, just a few sentences, order is emergent, and I have asked the speakers, as I said, to explain the vision of their own countries. From a European perspective, China, Russia, and India claim to represent not only the new vision of this order, but also alternative values to contrast with the liberal values of the West. While Latin America seems to be part of the Western value system, but tries to navigate among the other major players. We shall start with China, considered by the US as a main adversary, country that actively seeks to extend its influence. These days, President Xi is spending 9 days in Latin America, attending different summits and visiting different countries. This morning, for example, one of main Brazilian dailies, Folha de São Paulo, wrote, Lula speaks about dialogue instead of conflict, referring to Ukraine and Russia, while Xi defends true multilateralism. This morning, China Daily said that China and Brazil ties have never been better. They're the best in history. So, and also the Chinese Daily said, let us hope that a new president, referring to President Trump, ends the conflict as promised. Yun, can you explain to us what is the Chinese vision of this new world order? What would China like to achieve, and what are the methods? Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Mariana. It's really a great pleasure to be here today. I'm originally from China. I'm a China analyst. I travel to China 5-6 times a year to understand the motivations and the processes and the results of the Chinese foreign policy as Beijing sees it. So I'm very glad to share some of my observations about how China sees the issue or the concept of multipolarity, because there are some distinct characteristics of the Chinese view. First off, I guess I want to explain my presentations through several questions, just how in terms of framing the Chinese conception of the multipolarity. The first question is, while we talk about the multipolarity, what is not in the Chinese framing? How is multipolarity framed vis-a-vis what? What is the reference point? I think since the end of the Cold War, we have seen this effort from the Chinese official narrative and also official policy making to frame multipolarity or multipolarization as an answer or as a counter to what has been defined in China as unipolarity or unilateralism. Especially when you think about the end of Cold War, the unipolar power or the superpower that's left from the end of the Cold War is United States. This US unipolarity and unipolarization process is seen as not in China's national interest. Why? Because when there's one superpower, China will be automatically put in a second tier, and it also conveys certain justification for the superpower to impose some of US-made rules or US understanding of international order onto the rest of the world. So I think since the end of the Cold War, there has been this instinct from China to frame the global politics and international system as one that is either a multipolar world or a world that's morphing towards multipolarity. And it does create an image of equality among all nations. And I think in the Chinese framing, the most important equality is United States with other countries. So US will not be given this privilege, the special status, to enjoy certain privileges as a superpower. It also conveys a sense that China is a peer, where all countries, all powers, all poles of the world, they are equal peers in the multipolarity. So I think the concept of polarization or multipolarity in the Chinese narrative from the very beginning deliberately ignores or deliberately removes the power imbalance between United States and other powers. So in this narrative, it's multipolar, and every power appears to be equal, but it conveniently neglects the fact that while US is a superpower, and the other countries in terms of this framing are inferior in terms of comprehensive national power. Second question, who are the poles? If we talk about the multipolarity in the Chinese narrative, in the past, I would say for about 20 years after the end of the Cold War, the poles regarded in the concept of multipolarity in China has been primarily the second tier regional powers and major countries in different parts of the world. And the number of countries that we constantly see in the Chinese on the Chinese list are Europe, United States, of course, as one pole, Russia, China, and then behind China, there are other countries like India, Japan, but they are regarded as incomplete great powers or much less complete great powers. So that was a narrative, I would argue, from the end of the Cold War to somewhere around 2010. Then under Xi Jinping, we see the concept of the poles of multipolarity is also evolving. That now multipolarity is regarded as most importantly the rise of global South. So not just China, India, but also countries like Brazil, countries like Argentina, countries in the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia and UAE, key African countries, for example, South Africa, Ethiopia, these are all regarded as entities or members of the multipolarity. And that raises the question about China's relationship with global South. Well, China self-proclaims that China is a member of the global South, is being questioned by some countries in the global South, but also some countries in the global North. But regardless of the questioning, the Chinese self-definition is that China is still a member of the global South. Two characteristics in the current Chinese narrative about multipolarity. The first one is its emphasis on order, on orderly, vis-a-vis the concept of multipolarity would lead to chaos or anarchy, because if there are multiple powers and there is not a supranational or a international system to manage the relationship among these powers, then there's a fear that this would create more chaos and anarchy. I think here is the Chinese answer to the question that Majana, you raised earlier, that what are the rules that the Chinese are trying to retain in the international rule-based order? I think the first answer is United Nations, or a UN-led global system, or a global system where UN still plays a key coordination and, if not supervision role. That's partially because we always know that China, as a member of the P5, has seen that UN as a special mechanism that conveys China certain privileges in the international politics. But it does mean that in the Chinese foreign policy playbook, the UN mechanism is still enshrined as a key component or a pillar of the international system that the Chinese would like to see. But as a supplement to UN, we're also seeing more multilateral mechanisms that are becoming more and more prominent in the Chinese foreign policy playbook. Those include BRICS. Those include, for example, the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation, Forum of China-Arab Cooperation, the Lancang-Mekong Initiative, so regional and sub-regional multilateral mechanisms that the Chinese have sponsored in terms of the management or the coordination on regional and sub-regional affairs. So I think when China talks about order, it does have a significant number of global mechanisms and systems on its mind. But it goes to the question of, well, multipolarity, what is the implication here? Is it a great power competition implication, or where does the issue of multipolarity anchor in the Chinese foreign policy formulation? I think it goes back to the issue of global governance that follows the longstanding Chinese principle that countries should be equal and issues should be, or issues in the international affairs needs to be resolved based on consultation rather than coercion, or consultation rather than aggression. So last but not least, just some analysis and comments about this the Chinese vision or the Chinese view of multipolarity, because eventually it raises the question that is the Chinese concept of multipolarity, is it an end by itself, or it is a means to an end? Meaning that this framing, does this serve a bigger agenda on Chinese foreign policy playbook, or the multipolarity is indeed what China tries to strive as a desired endgame for international global system in the end? I think that the answer is the jury on that is still out. We still do not have a fully clear picture to that question, because skeptics could very possibly make the argument that, well, look, the Chinese framing of multipolarity is a tool. It's an instrument to, one, undermine the narrative that U.S. is a superpower, and therefore U.S. as a hegemon gets to decide the international rule-based international order. And two, if we do believe that currently we are living in the era of great power competition, and the world is morphing towards a bipolar world with China and the United States as a two poles, then one could also argue this Chinese concept of multipolarization or multipolarity is indeed an instrument for China to rally the support from the vast majority of the global South countries. China frames itself as a representative or as a leader of the global South, and basically leading the developing world in a battle against the developed world represented by the United States. So if that is indeed the endgame, or that is the eventual framing of the Chinese vision of the world, then the concept of multipolarity is more a means to an end rather than an end itself.
Well, it sounds to me that,
Thank you so much.
Just a short question. Well, it sounds to me that multipolarity means also that China wants to lead, just like the United States wants to lead. But that is how it sounds to me. But I would like to ask you, on policy that is of great interest for Europe, and that is the Chinese position towards Ukraine. Why is it important? It is important because now, before President Trump, before Trump becomes president of the United States, there is lots of speculation what will happen in Ukraine and with the war. And it is speculated that the only country that can push Russia towards negotiations is China. Do you think that China has this interest or not?
That's a great question. I would reframe it. I think there are two countries that can push Russia towards a negotiation table. One is the United States, because we're all very closely observing what President Trump's policy on the Ukraine war will be, because if he does indeed try to make a deal with Russia, regardless of what the deal looks like, then I think Russia will be very enticed or very intrigued by the offer that U.S. is willing to make. And I think Russia will have the interest to negotiate. On whether China has the ability to influence Russia or to push Russia to the negotiation table, I think there have been enough debate. China would argue that, well, we don't have that kind of power. And then I think European answers to that, well, is you are supplying their revenue, you are buying their oil. So if they don't listen to you, you can use coercion, you can use sanctions. And the Chinese counter argument to that is, well, you do realize that Russia is the largest nuclear power on our border, and we have had a turbulent history. What do you think is going to happen when we try to coerce Russia? So I think the assumption that China can influence Russia, I think, is still requires some close examination of the Chinese framing of their security relationship with Russia and what that is built upon. But coming back to the issue of Ukraine, I think the biggest variable at this point is not China, is President Trump, and it does affect China significantly because. You have to understand, starting 2017, 2018, the Chinese worldview has been heavily imbued, if not completely through the lens of great power competition. So when China looks at the war in Ukraine, it thinks about the war, the great power competition. When it looks at Russia, it thinks about great power competition. When it looks at the potential deal that President Trump may or may not make with Russia, China thinks about the great power competition. And what is the implication for China if United States does indeed seek a reconciliation or seek a deal with Russia? I think that is China's top concern. Just like in 2017, when Trump first became the president, China's top concern back then was also a potential detente between Washington and Moscow. So I would say that the answer to your question may not go into the direction that you think it will go into. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, Sergey Utkin, I would like now to you to explain the Russian view of this multipolar view. Today, I was reading, or yesterday rather, the speech that President Putin gave at the Valdai Club, that is the most important think tank in Russia. And he was also speaking how Russia defends the South against the aggressive European or Western world. And it is very interesting because President of Ukraine, Zelensky, speaks how Ukraine is defending democracy on the front. And then Putin says that he is defending the values for the global South and for the global majority. So they're both claim to defend values, but they're killing each other. So Sergey, please go ahead. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for inviting me, and it's great to have this discussion with very professional colleagues. What I can say about Russian attitude to multipolarity and the world order will not be too much different, I'd say, to what Yun Sun just presented in a very clear manner on Chinese approach. But I do think there are some important nuances related, of course, to Russia's historical path and, internal and external developments related to Russia, which were not identical to China. I'd say, for China, it was probably more of a coherent path and an obvious choice in favor of multipolarity, because China clearly has the potential to be one of the key poles in this world, and many even speculate about the coming new bipolarity with the US and China being the two major poles. So for China, it was not much of a doubt that it does have the resource to play a very important role in this multipolar world of the future. For Russia, it was more of a question mark kind of hanging above this notion. At the same time, you did have it gain in popularity right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's not a Putin's invention. It's not a new game that just appeared in the last years. It's a concept that developed in a way very logically, because in in the time of the Cold War, everybody understood the Soviet Union as being one of the two poles of the bipolar system. And of course, as it happens, it is hard for people to think completely outside the box. When they move to a different era, they still use old measurements very often. And in this particular case, this also happened. People still were looking for those poles in some sort of a system. They realized very easily and for understandable reasons that Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, will not really have the potential to play a role of second pole of a bipolar system anymore. And then what comes to your mind? It's a multipolar system where Russia would be one of the poles. You had a little bit of playing with the words in the Russian academia on that, because a number of people made an argument that multipolar is kind of not an accurate notion. If you think of physics and you think of a sphere, then there are only two poles that kind of are on the opposite sides of the sphere, like on the opposite sides of the globe, you have the North Pole and the South Pole. So you kind of cannot speak of multiple poles, some people said, and that's why they offered a different notion of a polycentric world, making a point that these various centers spread around the globe, they will not be all the same. They will not be all equal size. They can be different size. They can be more powerful, less powerful,
But can
they
we be
will
more
matter.
practical? What is this vision that Putin sells now? What type of the world? We're in the middle of the war. What is it that he said? What would he like to achieve?
Yeah, this is what I'm coming to.
Sorry.
I mean, this was sort of the origin of this idea, and the idea got to a large extent popularized, I'd say, by Yevgeny Primakov, who first was our foreign minister in Russia. Well, before that, the head of foreign intelligence, then the foreign minister, and then the prime minister. So in the 90s, he did have very serious leverage in terms of, adding ideas to Russian foreign and security policy discourse, which is what he did. He was a man with academic background, so he was not foreign to all these theoretical models and strategies. And he tried to marry decision-making in the state system with this theorizing that is pretty common in the academia. And he popularized this notion of multipolarity, polycentric world, and at the same time he sort of turned it in the practical dimension. And he was actually the one who first started this format of cooperation, initially trilateral cooperation with China and India. So the format that was back then called RIC, Russia, India, China, the first stage of what further developed in the BRIC and then BRICS, as we know. But at the same time, when Primakov was sort of offering these ideas, they were not the only game in town for Russia, and other games were more important. What was more important was the development of Russia's relationship with the West. And Russia understood back then that it had a lot to gain from this relationship. So up to a certain point, it tried to integrate into Western-led structures like the G7 that became G8 and the Council of Europe and a number of others. And this seemed for many a far more important thing in terms of impact on Russia's development than a loose group of Russia, India, China, very different countries with different interests, looking in different directions. People thought, well, that's rather a sideshow in comparison to our integration with the West, or in comparison with the development of integration mechanisms in the post-Soviet space, because some people, they did have this ambition of making Russia the new center of this sort of post-Soviet group of countries that will be almost like the European Union, but next to the European Union. So you had topics that were sort of more important for Russia back then. But we know how these topics developed. The relationship with the West ran into a complete catastrophe. I think this is an appropriate word to use. And the development of Russia's ties with the post-Soviet countries happened to be bumpy, at least. I mean, with a number of countries in this area, Russia still keeps very close ties and develops economic cooperation and maintains this customs union arrangement within the Eurasian Economic Union. But we see how it developed with, first Georgia, then Ukraine, a complete
now we have
disaster.
the war.
And
the thing is, there isn't much that, and now we have the war. We are worrying about nuclear weapons, and but at the same time, for President Putin, it is very important to show that he's not alone in the world. So what kind of world order can one offer today in the middle of the war?
Yeah, exactly. That's you're basically answering your question. The conditions that we have nowadays, they kind of push this topic of multipolar world order and what Russian officials call world's majority, to make a point that the West is the minority in the world in demographic terms. Well, in the end, also economically speaking, if you take all the countries beyond the West, they are also important. And China is already the leading economy if we take the figures by purchasing power parity. You see that this sort of remained as the only game in town for Russia. The government in the Kremlin, they cannot really have high hopes for anything in terms of relationship with the West. They do have their stakes in conflict with the West, but they do not have any hopes for cooperation with the West. They understand the limits of what they can achieve in the post-Soviet space, and their major stake at this point is that, through a number of tools that they're trying to use, including the BRICS group, they will make themselves to a true center of this polycentric world, where you'll have a number of great powers that will be far more important than other states out there. And Russia is supposed to be one of those states, along with China, India, and Brazil, a number of others. Of course, all of that is based on very loose institutional arrangements, and the BRICS is, of course, more of a club than any kind of integration structure, which is a point that many in the West have been making to downplay the importance of the BRICS. But the thing is that if you look around the world, you might conclude that what is rather an exception than the rule is the groups that you see in the West, like the European Union, NATO. You do not really have another European Union. You have a number of attempts to build economic integration groups in various parts of the world, but they're not exactly the same as the European Union, not that advanced. You don't really have any other collective security organization at the level of NATO. So to say that other organizations out there are not the EU, not NATO, is kind of too cheap of an analysis. And it turns out that the world out there, it is just less institutionalized. it is maybe more flexible, and this is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. We do have very serious issues that involve countries of the BRICS group. Of course, the war that has already been mentioned, but you also have very serious issues between the United States and China. You have the very serious international attention paid to Taiwan. You have all sorts of issues between India and China. You name it. We can compile a long list of issues, but at the same time, you have sort of a common interest of these countries to say, well, we have to remind the West that they are not the only ones who will shape the world of the future. And this, I think, is sort of the intention that goes beyond the lifespan of specifically, Mr. Putin or other leaders of BRICS countries. We can expect that it will remain there because, indeed, it would be quite arrogant to believe that to the end of the 21st century and beyond, you'd have the world order that is shaped by the United States. And as you know, politicians in the United States, they still use this notion of US-led world order. So the order will be changing, and these countries, they're kind of trying to make use of that in the ways they can. Whether these ways are exactly those that lead them towards prosperity and success on the global level, this is not a given, I'd say. But if you ask about sort of the worldview, which is mainstream and which is shared by the political elites in Russia, I'd say this is what they're trying to make use of to achieve their goals.
Thank you so much, Sergey. I will not ask about the Russian view of Ukraine for obvious reasons, but I will ask Sushant now to explain the view from New Delhi. President Modi is now in Latin America. He's visiting the Caribbean. He's attending just about every summit. I have just seen he was at the CARICOM, the meeting of the Caribbean countries. So, when you open Indian media, he seems to want to solve most problems around the world. And what is his vision? Does he have a vision, or he's in between these different visions? Sushant, please. And I know you have some slides.
Yeah, thank you, Mirjana, and it's great to be back at your forum. Essentially, over the next 10 minutes, and I know you have a hard stop at 10 minutes at 10:50 my time. Primarily, I will look at what the Indian officials, that is either the Indian Prime Minister or the Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, have spoken in the last couple of years about this idea of a multipolar world, or how the world looks like. If we could look at the slides, please.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Matthias, can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, so essentially, this is how India looks at the world currently. And I'm going by exactly what has been spoken by Prime Minister Modi or by his Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, since 2022, because what they said earlier has been contradicted and the world has changed dramatically in the last 2 or 3 years. So I'm just looking at last couple of years. The first point that Jaishankar makes is that the world is at an inflection point. It is rebalancing the post-World War II global order. The global order that was established by the winners of the Second World War is actually being rebalanced. And as Sergey said, as Yoon said, India also sees it as neither unilateral nor multilateral. It sees it as a very inelegant word, plurilateral. Multilateral means multilateral bodies like the United Nations or WTO or the World Bank would be able to fix rules. Whereas the plurilateral means that there are some certain powers, a multipolar world, where there are 7 or 8 or 5 or 6 powers, and in each region there might be more regional powers who are taking the decision, not like the United States taking every single decision everywhere in the world in the last 30 years. The third thing that the Indian government believes, or the Indian officials believe, is that India has to rise to become a great power or a leading power. But that rise, unlike every other country's rise, would be in a period of great volatility and unpredictability. Now, this is a significant shift from, because every other country's rise has been in a period of relative stability when the country is risen. And if India has to rise, it has to rise among this volatility and unpredictability, which makes it doubly challenging. But all throughout, Jaishankar is very clear. This is just 2 weeks back in Bombay. He said that the United States remains the most powerful country in the world. And he gave the reason for it. He was speaking to students and he gave the reason. He said, because of economy, because of industrialization, because they are technological centers, they still remain the most powerful country in the world, while India pursues multi-alignment or multi-vector policies, which allow it to work with multiple partners simultaneously on different issues. So this is essentially how India is able to operate out of BRICS, operate out of SCO, operate out of a Quad, operate out of other organizations, go to Ukraine, go to Russia. And Jaishankar has always been warning, or Mr. Modi's government has always been warning, that we should never confuse convergence for congruence. So essentially, certain interests converge. They are not shared interests. They converge at that point in time, and we work on those interests. We are never congruent. We are never an ally. We are never that close a partner or a friend. We are only looking at that specific interest, which is being served at that point in time. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's how, as I said, India is able to work in the Quad, in the SCO, in the BRICS. It can operate in multiple contexts and multiple spaces. So what the term the government uses it, India is multi-aligned, not non-aligned as it used to be earlier. It is not passive, but actively aligning on various interests at that point in time in that context. Mr. Jaishankar is on record saying India's relationship, the relationship with China is the key to the future of Asia. What the nature of India's relationship with China will decide which way Asia would go. And for the West and for the rest of the world, parallel rises of India and China present a very, very unique problem. And that's something which the world will have to pay attention to and try and look at how it is going to deal with this challenge. And because, Mirjana, you specifically asked me about the Russia-Ukraine thing, Jaishankar is on record just a week back, around 10 days back, saying very clearly that India is not looking at a role as a facilitator or a solver of a problem between Russia and Ukraine. It is just looking at itself as facilitating communication between the two countries. Whatever the two capitals want to be communicated to the other capital, it is doing that. It is not doing anything beyond that. And he was insisting that they're not doing anything beyond just passing messages between one side to the other side, like an old world pigeon or something. That's what they're doing. India is also currently providing military support to Israel, but of course, for various reasons, primarily economic reasons, wants peace in the region so that it doesn't continue to suffer from high oil prices, problems with trade, and all these other issues we know about. India is also very happy that Trump has been elected the president. A very senior official in Washington, D.C. Told me last week that one of the world capitals, which was the happiest with Trump winning elections, was New Delhi. They, of course, prefer Trump to any other administration. And as they have officially said, we have worked with 4 previous US presidents, including Trump. Mr. Modi hosted Trump in his home state, organized a massive rally of 100,000 people, organized a rally with Trump in Houston. So they've always backed Trump. They like that they can work with Trump. Although I do see some problems with the Trump administration, like on tariffs, on de-dollarization, on China and Quad, where India would be asked to do more, particularly on securities issues. So this is going to be a challenge going into the future. Next slide, please. Coming to the specific question of multipolarity. So what does India mean by multipolarity? As per the Indian government's official definition, multipolarity means that there are many independent centers of decision-making rather than just one or two during the Cold War or one in the post-Cold War, or now two being India and China. So this essentially means that India sees a world which is far more regional. So Russia can be a independent center of power in Europe. Germany can be an independent center of power in Western Europe. Whereas when it comes to Asia, India and China are powers. When it comes to Southeast Asia, maybe Indonesia is a power. When it comes to East Asia, maybe Japan is a power. So this is essentially a more fragmented world where every part of the world has their own regional powers, which are poles in their own right, which cannot be ignored. And India has been insisting that its ties with Russia and France, and this is an example which has been given at least 10 to 12 times in the last few months, are statements of multipolarity as much as theirs as ours. So when Russia and France engage with India independently, They are actually asserting a kind of a multipolarity for themselves or as their worldview, and not only supporting India's worldview or making the argument what India has been saying. So essentially, everybody in the world is wanting a multipolar world. And this is a new term which India has been using for the last couple of years, that India is the Vishwamitra under Modi. Mr. Modi has used this very regularly. Vishwamitra means a friend of the world. Vishwa is world and Mitra is friend. And this is a big shift from the term that he had been using for previously 7-8 years, which is Vishwa Guru, which is like a leader of the world, a teacher to the world. He is now using the term that India is the world's friend. And friendships are also not exclusive, particularly so in a multipolar world. India also believes, and this is on record, I'm quoting, Jaishankar says that US is actively trying to shape what would be the two poles, what would be their weight, and how these poles and what their weight is would benefit the United States. So this is something which the United States is actively trying to do. And as Yoon said in case of China, in case of India, it is very clear that multipolarity is not a recognition of global power redistribution, but it is seen as a strategic opportunity for India to become one of the poles in the world. The multipolarity is the only way India sees where it can become a global power, a leading power, where it is recognized as a power. India doesn't want multipolarity because it believes in the idea of multipolarity. India believes in multipolarity because that is the only way India can get a seat at the high table and can become the kind of a bigger power, a more powerful country than what it is, what it currently is. Let me be also very clear that India does not want to be a part of the Russian or the Chinese alternatives of a new world order, of a multipolar world. It is very clear that it wants to be a bigger stakeholder in the current US-led order. This is what people do not realize when people look at BRICS or people look at other forums. India does not want to be part of those alternatives. India sees itself as a part of the current US-led order, where it is a bigger stakeholder, where it is a much bigger power. And of course, instability can always put India under pressure to choose. As more instability comes, maybe the Trump administration will ask India to choose. It really cannot say multipolar. It might say choose between us and China. Are you with us? Are you against us? Like what President Bush said. That's something which would really put New Delhi under pressure. If there is one thing which I want you to take out of this is that every time any Indian official uses the term multipolar, they are clear. They always insist that if the world has to be multipolar, Asia has to be multipolar. And this is just a way of telling that we do not want China as the hegemonic power in Asia. And I'll give you two very recent examples. Modi met Xi Jinping in Kazan in Russia. There were statements issued by both sides. The Chinese statement mentioned a multipolar world. The Indian statement mentioned that Modi told him a multipolar world and a multipolar Asia. Jaishankar met Wang Yi in Brazil recently, 3 days back. Again, two separate statements. Wang Yi's statement says multipolar world. Jaishankar's statement says multipolar world needs multipolar Asia. And this is one big difference with China. India is very, very clear that it wants a multipolar world, but for a multipolar world, it wants a multipolar Asia because China is the primary strategic challenge it is trying to deal with. Next slide, please. Now I have a couple of minutes more, so I'll quickly say what this multipolarity means when you look from India's perspective. Essentially, India wants to become a leading power, not as a balancing power between two poles, etc. And for becoming a leading power, it has to be a separate pole, as I said earlier. So it wants to rebalance the distribution of power globally from what it has been historically since the end of the Second World War. The third thing is it wants reform of all global institutions. Now, reform not in the sense of making them more equitable or making them more fair, but only in the sense of that can we get a better seat at the table. India doesn't want Africans to get seat at the table or East Europeans to get, etc. India is only interested in, can I get a better seat at the table? Can I acquire more power? And the word reform is used in that manner, that this is unfair to us and we would want more. And the idea of multilateralism or multipolarity, of multipolarity and plurilateralism, essentially an idea of strategic autonomy, which India has always historically believed in, that I can work with Russia, I can work with China, I can work with Brazil, I can work with everyone. I don't need to choose anyone as my only friend. And of course, India would like to be seen as a leader of the global South and not a leader of the global South in the sense of as a trade union leader, what was old view of India in the 1980s and 90s, but as a more how should I say, more cool, new age kind of a leader where you're the vibes-based politics of the global South rather than being real interest-based politics of the global South. And that is why it has become difficult for India to do this. Of course, technology and innovation and all that India is doing, but at no point in time India wants the state sovereignty to go. So please remember, when there was a vote on the Chinese treatment of Uyghurs, India either abstains or India says no. Even at the peak of the border crisis, India has never voted against China on the Uyghur crisis. India believes state sovereignty is supreme, particularly because India has issues like Kashmir and others where it would not want others to do this thing. And more, India's behavior has become aggressive and assertive against soft powers. Look at Canada as an example. What India is doing with Canada, particularly with these alleged cross-border assassinations, transnational assassinations that have gone on there. Then, of course, India wants to be a Hindu nationalist state. If you see in the last few years, last 10 years, India only talks about Hindu rights, and not about the rights of other citizens or other religions. It sees itself as a Hindu country more. It behaves itself as a Hindu country more and more. And of course, it dreams of an unbroken India where the whole of South Asia or the Indian subcontinent is part of something called an Akhand Bharat, an idea which the Hindu ideologues, the forefathers of Mr. Modi and his organization, the RSS, have always believed in. It is a map that Mr. Modi instituted in the new Indian Parliament building, where a map of Akhand Bharat, which includes Pakistan, China, Tibet, Sri Lanka, etc., is all there. And of course, like China and like many other countries of the global South, India believes that there are no universal values. The idea of universal values or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a post-Second World War imposition by Christian countries, and these are Christian values which are being imposed as universal values. And there is no single idea of liberal democracy. India can have its own idea of a liberal democracy, and other countries should not tell India how the democracy should function. And in last 30 seconds, next slide, please. So essentially, there are three things: values, vision, and interest. And I think each of India's countries, whether in the West, whether in Europe, whether Russia, whether China, will find that India is focused only on its interest at that particular point in time and on values and vision. It would be very difficult to have values and vision aligned. And that is why under pressure, India's idea of a multipolar world or India's path to progress may come under great stress, because at the end of the day, it is the values and vision which provide the base on which interest can be shared. Otherwise, if you're only sharing interest, then they can change very, very quickly. And I think that's the challenge India is going to face in the future. Thank you, Mariana.
Thank you, Sushant. There were so many topics. I think we shall have to organize a lot of events to address everything that you have just said. I was going to ask a question, but I would rather invite Isidro. Where is Latin America? Where are the big Latin American countries like Mexico or Brazil in this world view? Because we have heard that Russia wants to be the leader of the global South. China is, in a way, through its economic power, the leader. India wants to be. There are so many leaders in the global South. Where is Latin America in your view, and where can it be placed in this panorama?
Okay, thank you, Mariana, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. And let me tell you that in the case of Latin America, Latin America is divided in two roads, major roads. The first one is Brazil, of course, who wants to become a leader also a leader like India of the global South. The other road is Mexico, and I could say Central America, and perhaps Colombia. It depends on who is in power, who is shifting more to the north. With the promises of nearshoring. And now, in the case of Brazil, I mean, that during the past 20 years, with the exception of the Bolsonaro years, the most important goal of Brazil is to counterbalance U.S. hegemony after the end of the Cold War. However, with the new tension that we have between the US and China and the post-COVID situation we have and the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, things have become much more difficult. And according to Celso Amorim, he was foreign minister with President Lula during his first and second presidential term. And he thinks that the challenge of the global south, in which, by the way, he considers China can no longer be included, will be how to face this rivalry without taking sides and making strategic use of the best that each of the superpowers can offer. At the same time, he says, the global south is not interested in a Chinese-American condominium, which is similar to what India wants, I think so, whose major goal is to avoid taking sides on major, no Chinese-American condominium that would be like the bipolarisms of the Cold War. So, I mean, for me, this position is what in some authors in Latin America have called active non-alignment. So this active non-alignment is quite different from the multi-aligned position that India has apparently. And the major goal of this active non-alignment is to avoid precisely taking sides on major current economic and geopolitical rivalries among superpowers, and to avoid a division of the world in two blocks, in which, as we know, countries from the south have to decide in which side they have to stand. So, having said that, I mean, Brazil is betting to build flexible alliances in the world, depending on the issue area where he wants to play. First, Brazil has good relationship with the great powers, the US, Russia, China, and the EU, but this doesn't mean that Brazil has some reserves. For example, Brazil condemned the Russian invasion to Ukraine because it considered it as a violation to the UN Charter. But at the same time, we know Lula did not impose sanctions to Russia. Brazil worked out with China, as was mentioned, a peaceful solution to the crisis, but with no success. And Brazil also condemned the Hamas attack to Israel in October 2023, but has condemned as well the disproportionate attacks of Israel to Gaza, asking for humanitarian ceasefire at the UN, and contrary to the position of the US and the neutrality manifested by key European countries. Okay, so as we know, Brazil was the host of the last summit of the G20, and he engaged the conversation with superpowers, in the China, the representative of Russia, the EU, and the US, and he submitted a North-South agenda with some appeal to the South, which is on hunger, poverty, climate change, and equality. At the same time, we know that Brazil will be hosting in 2025 the COP30, whose major goal is to accelerate the mitigation of greenhouse gases, mainly CO2, as you can see it here in these slides, and to raise funding for climate change adaptation, especially for countries of the South. At present, to reach that goals claimed by the Paris Agreement seems to wane, as we can see it. For example, China has become the major polluter of the world, and if European is waning, if the trends go this way, China become the major polluter if we take into consideration cumulative emissions. So why I'm showing this? Because as we know, Lula has become highly engaged in protecting and enlarging the Amazonian rainforest, which is the largest carbon sink in the world. And Brazil has a legitimacy to become a leader in abating climate change, or refraining climate change, and it could make an alliance with the European Union now that Trump it comes back to power, because we know that Trump wants to come back to fossil fuels extraction, and that China apparently has problems to attain its goal on climate change. So that's an opportunity. That's a kind of alliances Brazil can construct. And also, of course, we have talked a lot about the BRICS. For Brazil, the major goal to be a member of the BRICS is to change the global governance system. It has been said that through cooperation, that is not by force. It's very important that Brazil, as India, they are committed to peace, not change by force, like it seems to be the Russian case and the American case, with the reform of the UN. Why? Because, as we know, Brazil wants to become a permanent member of the Security Council at the United Nations, and he's working a lot for achieving that. In addition, alternatives to institutions such as the IMF and the IDB are introduced in the BRICS to promote emerging economies. That's why Brazil wants to be also this leader of the South. And this is the case of the new development bank, which is a kind of, the equivalent to the World Bank. But its headquarters are located in Shanghai, as we know, and it's mainly funded by Chinese money. Lula also participated in the last summit, which took place in October this year in Kazan, in Russia, where he, of course, met Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping. And in the final declaration, they reinforced the idea of multilateralism and multipolarity with equitable global development and security. And as we know, the bloc became enlarged with Egypt, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Ethiopia. Now, Lula invited Argentina, as we know, to join the bloc, but Javier Milei decided to remain out of the bloc, since he openly aligned with the US, especially with Trump. So that southern cone is not homogeneous, and now we have a split. Argentina is taking more or less the Mexican alternative, so to speak, and is heading towards the north. And at the same time, Brazil became opposed to the inclusion of Venezuela in the BRICS, despite the support he gave to the Chavista leaders in the past. And that's because, as we know, Brazil didn't recognize the recent re-election of Maduro. Now, in your left, you have Mercosur. I love the slogan of Mercosur, which says that for us, the South is our North. It says a lot. And for Brazil, Mercosur has been very strategic, and it was created in 1991 because it's the way to expand Brazilian influence in the southern cone and up to Central America. So for Lula, Mercosur and the integration of South America as a whole has been above all a political project whose major goal is to construct a stable, prosperous, and united South America based on democratic ideas and social justice. That is very important to highlight, because Brazil's non-alignment policy remains engaged with liberal Western values of democracy and social equality. These values are embedded in Mercosur's institutional building, and they explain why Venezuela, which used to be part of the bloc, it is now suspended, and why Lula has rejected its incorporation to the BRICS. And this is similar to what Sushant said, that India remains part of the Western world in terms of democratic values. Okay, so now in the case of Mexico, Mexico is moving the other way around. And it's been more and more aligned to the US because during these tensions, because as you know, Biden has launched an industrial policy in order to reinforce nearshoring and to relocate some value chains from Asia and of course also from China and from Taiwan to friend countries or to nearby countries. What's the definition of two of them? You must have a trade agreement, and this is the case with Mexico. Okay, so it's important to highlight that when NAFTA was crafted, originally, it was in order to enhance competitiveness of North America vis-a-vis Europe, not vis-a-vis China. Because when it was created, it was in 1994, the single market was already established, and the end of the Cold War opened opportunities for the European Union to expand, for European enterprises to expand to the east, and why not even to Russia. So the Americans, they thought that it was important to create a free trade community within North America in order to better compete with Europe. But now, as you can see in the graph, the fourth partner of North America has became China. And that's because the US also invited China and pushed China to join the WTO. And China profited very well of the WTO and other
Isidro, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I know. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. So, but I mean, my point is here that Mexico has very good positioning in North America because it has become the major supplier for the auto industries, and there are opportunities also for Mexico in batteries for electric vehicles and for microchips. So there are the opportunities there, and that's why Mexico is betting to attract investments in order to relocate in Mexico to export to America. But the problem now is with Trump. The Trump factor, as I said, we have domestic problems in infrastructure, public safety, but internationally, our major handicap is the Trump factor. What do I mean by this? Well, that Trump has said that when he comes to power, he will deport illegal migrants. And as you know, there are around 11 million illegal migrants in the US, which half of it are Mexicans. And second, Mexico, during the first Trump administration, became a kind of third safe party in order to host those deportees. So we have this pressure, but the most important one now is that Trump has made the access to North America uncertain. Why? Because as we know, Trump can impose tariffs in order to refrain migration or in order to press Mexico to give a solution to drug trafficking. So we are in a bad position. Mexico is in a bad position. Brazil is in much better position, in a bigger margin of maneuver than Mexico because of Trump. And I want to stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there is a saying, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. I would like to open the floor for questions. Even the speakers among themselves can ask questions. Just raise your hand, and whoever wants to start, please go ahead. Do I see anybody? No. Well, before I see, I have one raised hand. Who is it again? Johnson, please go ahead.
Thank you, thank you. Fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. I learned a tremendous amount. I want to ask a question to Sergey and Sushant about the Russian and the Indian framing of multipolarity and how this concept of multipolarity is reconciled with a power hierarchy. So the multipolarity seems to suggest that, oh, everyone is equal, it's multipolar. So I feel that it deliberately omits the differences in terms of the power gaps or the power differences. Does that come up, or is that an aspect? Does the Indian and the Russian framing of multipolarity take into consideration of that? Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, should I take a shot first? So, to the best of my knowledge, and great question. India's view of the multipolarity, as I mentioned, is hierarchical. It doesn't see everybody having equal power. In fact, it doesn't even see some countries having power in certain regions. It is actually very regional. It says, part of Asia can be multipolar in terms of Japan, Indonesia, Korea, whatever, and another part of Asia can be Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. So it doesn't treat every pole as equal in any way. Have these discussions taken place with Russia, which sees, I don't think even Russia sees itself as an equal to the United States or to China. So that misnomer would definitely not be there. But have these discussions openly taken place? Have these conversations taken place in think tanks or in academia? No, I am not aware of this. I think discussion about Russia is very limited in New Delhi. Very few people talk about Russia other than in terms of when it comes to China or the United States. And, that's a funny thing. India does so much of trade with Russia in terms of crude oil, in terms of weaponry, etc. But it doesn't really figure in the public discussion or public discourse or even think tank discourse other than outside of the United States, China angle.
Thank you, Sergey.
Yeah, well, basically, I'd say the absence of hierarchy is what makes multipolarity kind of appealing at this point for the Russian government, because it understands if we have strict hierarchy in the world, then Russia will be a third in this hierarchy at best, or rather at some lower positions. So it's not interested in some very strict hierarchy internationally, but at the same time, it is interested in keeping a hierarchy between what people mostly call great powers and the rest. And this is what you can also interpret in terms of spheres of influence. So I think Russia is kind of okay, and it is what the Russian government expects if each of those centers of power in the polycentric world will have a sphere of influence of its own that it will kind of dominate in a way. Smaller countries that will be more dependent and in a big extent following specifically this center of power and not others. And others will not interfere. And you know that one of the recurrent topics in the Russian political narrative is all sorts of, warnings to the West that they should not interfere in our domestic affairs. And these domestic affairs, they kind of grow bigger than the borders of the country itself. They grow to this sphere of influence. So this kind of hierarchy is kind of embedded in the Russian understanding of multipolarity. And again, it kind of suggests that also other powers that are big enough to play this game, they also have their own spheres of influence that Russia in its turn would have to respect. And if I may, I had a small question to our Brazilian. I had a small question to Isidro and to Latin America, and specifically to Mexico. Actually, we had quite some international attention to the new and similarly dynamic president of Mexico and sort of the change of government in the country. Do you think it comes with any new, fresh foreign policy ideas, or you expect more of a continuation of the same in that country?
Should I answer, Miriana?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Well, I mean, if I judge by the participation of Claudia Sheinbaum in Rio de Janeiro, I would say no. I mean, because what he proposed for the South is the globalization of this program, which is called Sembrando Vidas, which is a reforestation program where Mexico gives a salary to peasants in order to put trees to reforest a major part of the country, and she proposed that, but this was the same that AMLO proposed. AMLO was a former president at the beginning of his past presidential term, when AMLO López Obrador wanted to deter illegal migration from Central America. He proposed that. Give some money to plant some trees, you become green and you create jobs. Well, it didn't work. There's no assessment of this plan. So the fact that she proposed the same in Rio de Janeiro this week shows to me that there's no new strategy of foreign policy. And I don't know whether they are prepared in order to absorb all the pressures that will come from the US now with Trump.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, or shall I? I don't see any hands. No? Okay. Well, the world is Monica Schneider, please, and please introduce yourself.
Hello, thank you very much for these very interesting topics. I'm from the magazine Südwind in Vienna, and I have one little question. Thank you very much to Sergey Utkin, also about talking about the smaller countries, how also the domestic affairs can be bigger than the borders and go beyond the borders. And I was wondering how you would see this also for Taiwan and China.
I'm not clear. So how we see this?
What is the question?
My question is how you do see the situation of Taiwan and China in this new world order, where bigger countries are, not seeing interference in their domestic affairs as much as before. So how?
I don't understand the question, really. You mean?
Sorry, I can say it again. So with this change, with the spheres of influence, that the smaller countries are more depending also on bigger countries, and how this can actually change the situation for smaller countries, that they cannot rely on support from other bigger countries when situations as conflict arises.
Do you want to say that who would intervene if China enters Taiwan? Is that your question?
Exactly.
Okay. Okay.
Interesting question. I think when China thinks about the multipolarity, and through the lens of, for example, great power competition, I think the Taiwan issue is always in the background, right? Taiwan issue, other people don't talk about it every day, but the issue of Taiwan is China's #1 top national security concern, and the US factor is seen as the single largest independent variable in how China sees the solution and implement the solution of the Taiwan issue. So I think that's part of the reason why China is so vehemently opposing the US, a unipolar world, or the framing of a unipolar world under American leadership, because that will automatically transfer transpire as legitimization or the justification of whatever the United States sees as fit in terms of a worldly or global response to a Taiwan contingency, if there is going to be one. I think the question of smaller countries' alignment choices on Taiwan, not sure if that's a multipolar question. If the question you're really trying to ask is, what if European countries decide to be more supportive of Taiwan because now they have agency, and in light of the war in Ukraine, they also have more incentive to speak on behalf of the invaded. I think it drills down still back to the issue of power politics. I think European countries will have such a option to take those positions, but those options are going to come at extremely high economic and diplomatic costs. And those costs will be I think, a deliberation for the individual governments to decide whether it's worth the effort they will be trying to make. I think U.S. would welcome a coalition or a more aligned voice on the issue of Taiwan. But even in the United States, I would say there is a very sober recognition as for how other countries are limited in terms of their approach, because by the end of the day, Taiwan is a U.S. security partner, is also the legitimacy and the credibility of U.S. alliance system in the region and U.S. leadership in the free world, right? So you have to ask the question that what are European countries' skin in the game? What would be the incentive for them to stand up against China in light of Taiwan contingency, against significant economic, political, and other costs? So there's no right answer. I think there will be countries that feel much more motivated to stay in a principled position. But we also know that international politics is not always about principles. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other question? Or I have a question. We are talking about a multipolar world. We are talking about big countries around the world wanting to have more of a say, but and that sovereignty should be kept. But what happens with the Middle East? People are dying there. Is there some sort of what is the position of the big ones who want to have a bigger say in what is happening around the world? Is there any understanding for the victims, any type of victims who are dying, whether it's Sudan or it is in the Middle East, or it is a question of respecting sovereignty? Would anyone want to reply to that?
Yeah, so I can talk about India. In India, there is no moral position on this right now, or a humanitarian position on this. We have not seen any statements of that kind. Statements have been very very superficial, in the sense that the world needs peace. This is an era of peace. Can we have peace in some manner? And in certain arguments, the Indian officials say that this would be good for Indian economy. This would be, we don't want that kind of instability because we want to create some more infrastructure there. But other than that, if you're asking me specifically, is there a moral position? Is there a humane position? Is there a humanitarian position? No, that's very, very limited, other than just providing some token aid to Palestinian authorities, etc. It is very, very limited. At least New Delhi doesn't have a strong moral or a humanitarian position on the Middle East right now.
And what would you say, Yun? How about the Chinese position to what's happening in the Middle East? It's very near us here.
I understand. I think it comes back to the issue of great power competition, right? If you look at how China is framing the Gaza crisis, there is almost a one-sided bias against Israel, or whatever legitimate security concerns that Israel might have. And there's a very clear tendency for China to take the position along the lines of who is U.S. ally. And I think China has, by default, picked the side of the Palestinians because, well, by the end of the day, the Arab world or the Muslim world is a much bigger bloc that China would like to gain support from. So in the Chinese narrative, as we see repeated efforts to frame the Gaza crisis as a result of U.S. irresponsible policy and U.S. unlimited support of Israel. So I feel that at least in terms of the current crisis, we're seeing this as a manifestation of how China is trying to undermine the credibility and the legitimacy of U.S. presence in the region. Again, it stands to change. The Chinese do recognize that Abraham Accord is something that the Chinese are not able to produce, not now, not in the foreseeable future. So there's still a clear recognition of the U.S. status as a deal maker, as a single largest external influence, and also as a security provider in the region. But it doesn't mean the Chinese are not trying to undermine it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jorge Alvarez Fuentes, would you like to ask the question or shall I read it?
I'll be most glad to make the question. Thank you very much, Mariana.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. I'm Ambassador Jorge Alvarez from Mexico, and I'm very glad to be attending this very interesting discussion. What role do you see for an unreformed United Nations in a multipolar world order? I perceive that there's different views, whether it be from China or Russia, certainly from the US. Is there a role, if any, at the current moment in time?
Thank you so much. Can I ask who would like to reply? We have 3 minutes left. Who would like to reply? Sergey, go ahead.
Yeah, well, indeed, the United Nations remains unreformed, and very few people believe that thorough reform is possible, although you have a number of ideas on enlarging the number of permanent members of the Security Council. You have some other interesting thoughts on how it could be made, but you need a kind of consensus for this that is not in the cards at this moment. And given the tensions between Russia and the West, I think we are probably now further away from the actual reform that would be supported by everyone than we were some time ago. But I think both the Russian government and I would dare to say also other countries of the BRICS, they treat the United Nations as a global forum, unique one in this capacity. And as you must probably know, the Foreign Minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, who is in this position for some amazing number of years, like 20 years. He used to be Russia's representative to the UN, so he knows the system from within, both its strengths and its weaknesses. So I think they treat it indeed as a forum, as a meeting place, as a mechanism that can be useful on some narrow topics. For example, in spite of all the acute conflicts between Russia and the West, the UN Security Council is still able to adopt a number of resolutions, for example, prolonging the mandates of existing UN peacekeeping operations. So it looks like Russia still feels there's a value in this. And of course, it understands that if we kind of try to reset the global organization and have something instead of the UN, Russia will most probably not have the leverage that the Soviet Union had back in the day when the UN just appeared to ensure its very central place in the organization. So in principle, I think the Russian government has reasons to stick to these existing mechanisms of the UN, but the problem is that when it comes to core interests of a certain country, they use veto power and tools available to them in the UN system very deliberately. We just saw it with two ongoing violent conflicts in case of Sudan, it was Russia that disliked the draft resolution offered to the UN Security Council on the ceasefire, and it kind of criticized it as being too much sort of written from a Western angle. And then you had a resolution on the ceasefire in the Gaza crisis, and that was vetoed by the United States alone. So you do have major powers making use of this veto in the ways that basically every other country on the Security Council is not ready to support. And that makes me think that, yeah, we will still have the UN around, but I don't think it will play the crucial role in, negotiations, be it around Ukraine or on other important topics.
I do thank you so much, Sergey. Our time is up. I thank all four of you. I thank the audience, and there is one thing that unites us all, and that is climate change. Probably next time we shall join to talk about it, because we can all burn while different powers are fighting for their place in the world. In the meantime, we shall have floods and very hot summers. And I do hope that at least on certain levels, the emerging powers, the big powers, can find a common language, at least for climate change. Thank you very much. And I see we shall have to continue addressing these issues on a bigger scale rather than only in Europe, which is just one part of this big world. Daniela?
Thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you so much to our audience, and thank you, Mirjana, and hope to see you all again soon, be it in Vienna, be it online.
Thank you.
Goodbye, nice afternoon, nice day, nice evening.